Hi everyone, this is Andy from Med School EU, and today we're finally diving into our major topic called Anatomy and Physiology of Systems in Humans and their Interactions. So I decided to break down this unit into multiple videos, and each video I'm going to do my best to try to keep them short and sweet so I can provide lots of information in just several minutes, so it is easier to grasp the material and easier to follow along. So today we are going to begin with the anatomy of our skeletal system. So just a little brief introduction about bones and how many bones we have and the types of bones it's broken down into and the systems that we've got, and also a little bit of anatomy about our brain and parts of the brain. So starting from the top and working our way down. So first, let's begin with the skeletal system. I'm just going to highlight the number of bones. So typically in the human body, we've got 206 bones. And if we're looking at the skeleton of our human body, it is divided into two separate skeletons to make things a little bit easier. There's the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So first, we're going to talk about the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton has, in total, 80 bones from the 206. So that's just kind of the number that we'll keep. Oops, it's the number that we'll keep here. The axial skeleton with 80 bones includes the skull bones and the associated bones with the skull. So the bones right up here, there would be 29 bones. So there's 8 bones in the cranium. There's 14 bones in the face. That makes up the skull bones. So that's skull. And there's also the associated bones. There's 6 auditory ossicles, so these are bones that are inside our ears, and there's a bone called hyoid. So these are called associated bones, and there's going to be 7 of those in total. That makes up the skull. So skull plus associated bones makes up 29 of those bones. Now, working our way down, we have the thoracic cage. And the thoracic cage, of course, 25 bones. The thoracic cage has the sternum, which is lined right down the middle here. That's the sternum bone, this large bone right there, and we've got 24 ribs, 12 on each side, and they would be connecting, most of them would connect to the sternum. And the last part, which would be the vertebral column, so that would be the vertebrae. So vertebral column, and if we do the math right, it's 26 bones in the vertebral column. We've got 24 vertebrae. So vertebrae are the bones in our spine. And here at the bottom, we've got the sacrum and the coccus. So the sacrum and the coccus. So these would be labeled here at the very bottom. I'm going to break down the vertebrae and the number of vertebrae that we have. So we've got cervical. We're going from the top to bottom. So cervical, there's 7 cervical bones. And the cervical bones would include the atlas and the axis. So that would be, C1, C2, C3. That's all the way up to C7. C1 is the atlas. So here C1 is atlas, called atlas. It has a special shape. It's different than all the other cervical bones or cervical vertebrae. And C2 is the axis. And the axis is also different from the atlas and all the other outlining bones in the vertebrae. So that's the 7 cervical bones. They go all the way down to C7. Next, we've got the thoracic bones. Thoracic. And there are 12 thoracic bones. So it goes from T1 to T12. And more or less, those are the same sort of shape. And just to note, cervical bones and thoracic bones experience lots of movement. This is why we can bend our back, we can bend forwards, we can bend backwards. That is all due to the movement of cervical and thoracic bones. And at the bottom, we've got lumbar bones. There are 5 lumbar bones. And these lumbar bones, they have a lot less movement than the cervical and the thoracic, especially as you get to the bottom to L5 and L4. And finally, we reach the very bottom, which would be called the coccygeal. And these bones are fused, so there's 4 bones, and they are fused, meaning that they do not move. There's no movement in the pelvis. That's the coccygeal bones from the vertebrae. And the second part is going to be the appendicular skeleton. Appendicular skeleton. So we talked about the axial skeleton from the head and going down the spinal cord, or going down the spine, and the ribs, the thoracic cage. The rest is the appendicular skeleton. And this skeleton primarily encompasses the limbs. So we've got, the 2 arms, 2 legs, bone called clavicle. There's a bone behind, there's a bone on each side behind on our upper back called the scapula. And also that would be the hands. So hands, 2 hands, and 2 feet. So that's all of the bones that encompass the appendicular skeleton. And together, the appendicular skeleton makes up 126 bones. I don't think you need to memorize the numbers of the bones. However, you should know the general classification of the skeletal system in terms of the axial, the appendicular, and probably the spine as well. Just knowing thoracic, lumbar, and cervical, the number of bones they've got, and which ones are movable and which ones are fused. So now we are going to go through some basic brain anatomy. First, I'm going to label these parts. Now, of course, this is going to be the front. That's the back. And first, I'm going to label all these parts of the brain, and then we're going to talk about some of their basic functions. So this entire part right here is called the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. The one over here is called the parietal. Now let's discuss their basic function. So for the frontal lobe, the basic function is motor control. So motor control. So through our frontal lobe, we're able to innervate our muscles. We have problem solving. Problem solving. So thinking area, and speech production. That's the general function of the frontal lobe. Now the parietal lobe, the function is touch perception, so it's sensory. In some cases it's called somatosensory cortex, and body orientation. So primarily, the parietal lobe is focused on sensations and really being aware of position of the body, being aware of the environment, being aware of our internal feelings, everything is meshed up in the parietal lobe. All of that information goes there where it is sorted, and the actions would be imposed by the frontal lobe after problem solving. The occipital lobe is mostly responsible for sight. So your eyesight, that's called the visual cortex. And that would include visual reception, so receiving the signals, and visual interpretation, so interpreting what the image is. You're looking at it, you know it's a pencil. You're looking at the screen, you know you're looking at a brain. That's all of that processing occurs in the occipital lobe. Now the cerebellum is responsible for balance and coordination. Balance and coordination. So when you get drunk off of alcohol, typically the first part that is affected is the cerebellum of the brain. This is why a lot of times if somebody goes too far with the drinking, their balance and coordination is off. So the spinal cord here, we could also call this brain stem. So brain stem that would lead to the spinal cord, and so I wouldn't really call it spinal cord. I would call it brain stem, and the brain stem is responsible for some of the most important physiological responses. They're involuntary responses. So for example, it controls things like our pulse, controls breathing, it controls a number of different reflexes like coughing or vomiting or sneezing. All of these different reflexes and some of the most fundamental functions that keep us alive, all of these responses, those basic functions that we have, are coming off from the brainstem. They're involuntary functions like heartbeat, our pulse, whether or maybe that would be just simple breathing, because breathing could be voluntary, could be involuntary. But when we don't think about it, the brainstem is responsible for it. Things like coughing, swallowing, vomiting, all of these responses are going to be from the brainstem. These are all reflexes that happen automatically. And finally, the temporal lobe is responsible for auditory processing. So this is responsible for hearing. Also language comprehension, so language. So it's able to interpret the things that you hear, the sensation of hearing. It's also responsible for memory and information retrieval, so also memory. And finally, we are going to discuss a sagittal cross-section of the brain and look a little bit deeper beyond the lobes to describe their functions and the specific anatomy here. So what we've got, I'm going to begin with more of the outside. This little watery layer is called the meninges. Meninges. And meninges are there to protect the central nervous system. So the meninges and the ventricles actually travel down all the way the spinal cord, and it's just this meningeal fluid that it's called the cerebral spinal fluid that flows within these meninges and is able to provide protection for our central nervous system. Now looking more inwards, this large area right here that's all around would be the frontal and the parietal lobe. That would be the cerebral cortex. So it's called cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is responsible for movement, sensation, and all of those things that are associated with the parietal and a lot of the frontal lobe as well. Now going into this structure right here that's kind of going around like that, that's called the corpus callosum. So corpus callosum. And corpus callosum is the relay center between the right and the left hemisphere of the brain. So the brain is not actually all uniformal like that. It has a division right in the middle where the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And in order for them to coordinate their movements, for example, moving our hands, speech, eye movement, all of those things are going to be coordinated, and because of the information that will be relayed from the right hemisphere to the left and from the left to the right. And that information, that bridge, is going to be relayed by the corpus callosum. Very important thing to understand. Next, we've got the thalamus. Thalamus. And thalamus is called the relay center. It takes in all the sensory input. It takes in all kinds of sensory input and a lot of the signals from other parts of the brain, and it's able to redistribute them. It's basically just a redistribution center. So if you have, think of it as packaging. If you have a redistribution center for Canada Post, everything has to come within that center before it gets redistributed to the homes or different businesses. The thalamus is that Canada Post relay center. Now, the next part here is going to be the hypothalamus. So just below that will be the hypothalamus. And we're going to discuss the hypothalamus in great detail when we look at the homeostasis unit. Because the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of the homeostatic responses. It's able to release and stimulate the release of plenty of different hormones that would basically correspond to different types of stimuli. So hypothalamus is very, very important, and it's a structure that we're definitely going to talk about a lot more further in the course. Now, this little thing that's sticking out, this one right here that actually goes right along the hypothalamus, it's called the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is actually coexists with the hypothalamus, because hypothalamus is going to direct signals to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is actually the one that's going to release hormones and is able to stimulate the release of hormones. But that all is directed by the hypothalamus. And I wanted to mention that some of these labels are not going to be accurate, especially within this middle area. So the exact location of these labels is not important. What's important is to note their functions, because hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and just kind of the general outline of what they look like. The pituitary gland is just this little thing that's sticking out of the hypothalamus and the thalamus. But the thalamus, hypothalamus, and there's plenty of other things that are meshed up right in the center there. All of those is difficult to distinguish, especially for somebody that has not studied brain anatomy in great detail. However, for the purposes of this course, you must know the functions of hypothalamus, thalamus, and the pituitary gland without knowing their exact locations on a diagram. Now, this one is the cerebellum. We already mentioned this one. It's responsible for coordination. So a lot of these structures, this one that's kind of sticking out of the brain stem is called the pons. This even smaller one that's sticking out is called the medulla. And it's the medulla that's responsible for a lot of the major functions like breathing, or I guess I should say involuntary breathing, and other things that the brain stem is coordinating. And all of these things that would include the pons and the medulla, both of these would make up the brain stem. So that's the general labels of the sagittal cross-section of the brain. Again, you must memorize and you must understand the functions of the hypothalamus, function of the pituitary gland, and just the general outline of it. Function of the corpus callosum as well, thalamus, meninges, and the ventricles. So there's inside of these, there's ventricles that look similar to meninges that have the cerebrospinal fluid for protection, and the cerebral cortex as well. So just remember the general structure of them and their general functions. And we're going to dive more deep into the functions of the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands further in the course. So this concludes our first lecture on this lengthy topic of anatomy and physiology of systems in humans. And in the next video, we are going to talk about our second part, which is going to entail the circulatory system.